Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, China and Myanmar pursue deeper bilateral ties as the two countries' leaders meet in Beijing. China's economy maintained steady growth momentum in the first 5 months. Ukraine and Moldova are entering the first phase of European Union membership talks. Japan raises interest rate to the highest level since 1995. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called on China and Myanmar to steadily advance key projects of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor to help Myanmar develop its economy and improve livelihoods. He made a remark in a meeting with President Hlaing in Beijing. The Chinese leader said China is ready to share its development experience with Myanmar, adding this year marks the start of China's 15th five-year plan. The Myanmar president said China's rollout of the country's latest five-year plan has created major opportunities for its Asian neighbors. He said Myanmar is looking forward to strengthening bilateral cooperation with China and enhancing bilateral trade and investment volumes. Aung is currently on a state visit to China until Friday. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow, joining us from China Institute of International Studies. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Yang Xiyu. During the meeting, the Chinese president used wordings such as brotherly friendship and comprehensive strategic cooperation to describe ties between China and Myanmar. What do you make of Xi Jinping's key messages to Myanmar during this meeting?
Those keywords represented by President Xi Jinping reflects very special nature of China-Myanmar friendship, which based on both historical tradition and existing mutual shared interests. Therefore, the two countries' relationship has built as a framework for the community of the shared future. That is why President Xi used such keywords to describe the relationship between the two great countries.
The two leaders witnessed the signing of a series of cooperation documents covering areas including cross-border transportation in the greater Mekong sub-region, free trade, assistance in natural disasters, health, and media. Why is it important for China and Myanmar to cooperate in these areas?
I think those areas are key parts of the bilateral relation between the two countries, simply because every specific area you mentioned, target-oriented cooperation project targeting at both sides' mutual interests. For example, the sub-region of the Great Mekong Corridor. Both China and Myanmar occupies very important part and position for the greater projects. Without the close cooperation between China and Myanmar, not only the two countries cannot achieve their mutual interests, but also will affect the wider range of countries in this region for the greater cooperation and the greater benefits achieved. Therefore, the two countries, after the close exchanges and consultations and discussions, they planned very thoughtful. They have made very thoughtful plans for every specific regions, as you mentioned, for free trade that can not only enhance the bilateral economies, but also can enhance the cooperation and the development of the corridor. Also, by the same token, people-to-people contacts, media cooperation, and cooperation in meeting the challenge of natural disasters, enhancing the health cooperation. Those areas also supports the wide range of development of the two countries also support the key projects as a comprehensive pillar. We call it a corridor. So the wide range of cooperation plan and projects can pose a very bigger space for greater development for both sides.
The China-Myanmar Economic Corridor is a project under the Belt and Road Initiative, and as part of this economic corridor, we know a cross-border oil and gas pipeline has been built, and there is also a plan to construct a deep-sea port in Myanmar, etc. How can the two sides address the safety issue when advancing the construction of the economic corridor?
Let me put that this way. This is a very important question, especially for this presidential visit by Myanmar. As we know, connectivity is the nature of the Belt and Road Initiative. And connectivity between Myanmar and China is a key pillar for the greater cooperation. So the projects you mentioned, both from the pipelines and the deep sea port construction, reflects the deepening cooperation and the deepening development of the connectivity. With the enhanced, enlarged connectivity, I think both China and Myanmar will get greater mutual benefits. And as well, with the deepened connectivity between the two countries, the Belt and Road Initiative will get more and more benefits and momentum from this specific project. Therefore, such cooperation between the two countries will benefit not only for the two sides, but also will benefit to the region, to the initiative network as a whole.
President Xi Jinping has also voiced support for Myanmar in terms of advancing the country's domestic peace process and restoration of stability, internal stability. What kind of specific support do you think China can offer to Myanmar in this regard?
I think President Xi Jinping touched on the very sensitive and important issue in Myanmar domestic problem or troubles with equal footing base. That is very unique China-style pulse diplomacy. As everyone knows, the domestic turmoils and conflicts in Myanmar, within Myanmar, is a decades-long troubles or problems with very complicated domestic and external factors. However, China, as a very important neighbor of Myanmar, has been insisting on the non-interventional principle based on equal footing principle to deal with the issue of Myanmar's internal turmoils. That is why President Xi used the words say support. Say that means not intervene, not being involved. Say support any positive efforts for the peace, for the stabilities in domestic of Myanmar. Therefore, China's position with this presidential visit by Myanmar, with the summit between two countries, China's principles and positions will produce more powerful influences positively to push the situation in Myanmar towards peace and stability for the peaceful solution.
After Min Aung became the president of Myanmar, we know he first made a foreign trip to India, and now the visit to China represents his second foreign trip as the country's president. Why do you think India and China are the first two countries that he has chosen to visit?
In my observation, in Southeast Asia, Myanmar is, of course, a very big country, is a great country. However, this country neighbored with two bigger neighbors. One is India, the other is China. As a middle country, the so-called middle country, middle power in Asia, the Myanmar sat between India and China So for their interests, I think the new president, is seeking for a sort of balancing diplomacy. That is why he chose the first two countries to visit, not for Europe, not for America, but for their own two big neighbors. That really reflects their intent to keep balancing relationship, keep balancing good relationship with both India and China, so that they can enjoy more stable, more sustainable development and more stable situation for sustainable development. I think that is why they choose the two countries as the first visit target countries.
Hmm. In a bigger picture sense, Dr. Yang Xiyu, what do you think the way in which China deals with its relationship with Myanmar tells us about China's neighborhood diplomacy?
It's a very good question. I think President Xi's meeting with the Myanmar president reflects, again, China's neighbor diplomacy, the nature of China's neighbor diplomacy, that composed by the friend, equal footing, with the spirit of the shared future. I think, in other words, China's neighbor diplomacy is designed to build a community of the shared future with all neighboring countries. I think China's policy deal with towards Myanmar typically reflects this core spirit, say, designed to build a community of the shared future with Myanmar. In other words, what we are doing, what we have been doing for Myanmar in policy aspects reflects we are trying every efforts to doing the same with every neighboring country, so that we can build a community of the shared future with all our neighboring countries. That is why during this summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed the importance of the community of the shared future with Myanmar. China's foreign diplomacy also addressed the importance of the shared future with Myanmar. The two countries can build a community of the shared future. That reflects the neighboring countries' nature, also reflects the direction for China's policy towards the neighboring area.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow with the China Institute of International Studies. This is World Today. Stay tuned.
Hello, I'm Yan Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China's economy maintained steady growth momentum in the first 5 months of this year. The National Bureau of Statistics says the value-added industrial output in China increased by 5.4% in that period, with growth underpinned by the performances of the equipment and high-tech manufacturing industries. In May, value-added industrial output rose by 4.5%, accelerating by 0.4 percentage points from the pace seen in April. From January to May, retail sales of consumer goods reached 20.6 trillion yuan, or over 2.8 trillion US dollars, an increase of 1.4% year on year. Total retail sales of consumer goods and services increased by 2.8%. So joining us now on the line is Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, Dr. Zhou Mi, judging from the latest official figures, do you think it is fair to say that industrial production has remained a key driver for China's economic growth?
Well, I think that it is true that because when you are looking at those data, Maybe the first data you will notice is that the value-added industrial production. So when we're talking about the GDP of China, everybody is talking about China's ability to have a stable growth or not. So in many cases, we can find that the manufacturing is one of the major forces for us to keep on our abilities for development. So the manufacturing is not just coming from the investment, but also coming from its performance. Manufacturing is important for us because it not only meets the demand of the domestic industries, but also having so many good supply to those countries who want to import from us, especially when they are trying to have a better intermediate products or some kind of raw materials coming from China. I think that China's industrial production is really good for them. Well, another one is that we are seeing the manufacturing, especially for the industrial production, many of them are coming from some new products, the digital products, some of the green products. I think these kind of things are really very new and have a very strong ability to support the development of the GDP in China. So I think that for the industrial, production, it is really our indicator that we can observe the performance of the China's economy.
Yeah. So if we are to break down the data for industrial sectors in May alone, value-added output in the mining industry rose by 2.3%. Manufacturing output rose by 4.4%, while the production and supply of some public utilities like electricity, heat, gas, and water, etc., it grew by 7.6%. What do you think these sub-figures tell us?
Well, when you are decompose those industries in the subsectors, I think that it's especially accelerating coming from the raw materials to some of these other areas. For the raw materials, it is a lot of fluctuations because of some of this disruption in the Hormuz Strait, and also some of the lot of fluctuations on the international commodity markets. Well, for China, I think that we can find that the figures are not growing very quickly. That is because that many of the strengths has been put not to having the raw materials. They are really trying to improve their value added in the production, like some of the processing and other areas in the industrial chain. So for the kind of public utilities, I think that is really a big increase about the growth, because that they are really the support for China's development, no matter from the consumption side, the demand side, or the supply side. So for those kind of utilities, it's representing some of this demand from the cities, the urbanizations, and also the development of the industries. So they really are good things. Well, the manufacturing actually is in the middle. The manufacturing is not just trying to have some processing. They also are a very important role to connect the raw materials with some of this demand coming from the market. Manufacturing is really are performing stable in my understanding. The 4.4% is really similar to the GDP growth. So if you combine all these different levels or different kinds of industries, I think that's it's generally reflecting that the GDP growth in China is much more stable and have a different ability to deal with some of these uncertainties.
Regarding consumption, many international media outlets are paying attention to this. The monthly retail sales for the month of May declined for the first time since December 2022, even though the overall figure for the first 5 months still saw a growth. What is your perspective for this? For example, do you see a need for the Chinese government to consider more policy measures to stabilize consumption? Why or why not?
Well, I would say that consumption is still our priorities for the policies, because we want to have a stable consumption based on the people's abilities to have a better life. So for the consumption, as you mentioned, that the consumption for the retail sales, especially for the goods, are not performance as strong as first 4 months. But generally speaking, I would say that the people's demand are still met. So if you're talking about the policy, I mean the trend, I think that why we want to use better or stronger policies is that we really find that there may be two possibilities. The first one is that the consumption has not been encouraged enough for people to have the willingness to buy more things from the daily life. And the second reason is maybe that the demands are there, but we are not able to meet the demands. So for either of these kind of conditions, I think that consumption policies are really needed for us to try to understand the market in a better way and trying to identify the special and some differential consumptions from different regions. In China, all the regions have so many differences. Many of these coastal areas, they are able to deal with higher end of the consumption. But for the people living in the middle and the western part of China, they really want to have more connecting with the international market. So the consumption policies are still needed, as we can find from the government, the priorities this year. They are still trying to improve their abilities for better consumption.
It is very clear that during the first 5 months, retail sales of services saw faster growth than retail sales of consumer goods, right? So what do you think this tells us about the transformation of the Chinese economy?
Well, that is very interesting because, for the first several months, we have seen that Chinese government has published quite a few of the plans, the policies, or different kind of measurements to encourage the consumptions in the services. I think that is because that we are really thinking that the Chinese consumption market is really need more things. They're not just trying to buy the one TV after another, one mobile after another. I think most of these kind of hardwares are still there. So the people are already having the abilities for the basic demands on those kind of consumption goods.
Yeah.
But what's more, what can we do to provide the consumers? So the services would be one of the possibilities. We want to give the people more choices. Well, if you're looking at the inward FDI from other countries, many of these investments are encouraged to go to the service sectors, or some of them are really thinking that China's environment or the possibilities for consumption in the services are so large. So they really want to do more. So based on that reason, I think that the consumption services are much more potential for a better development compared with consumption in the goods. So I think that is also a very good reflection about the structure of the Chinese economy. It's gradually transferring from the focus on the consumption in the goods to the consumption in the services, or both of them together.
Chinese officials, economic officials, have also openly admitted that there is some kind of domestic imbalance between supply and demand. So, Dr. Zhou, what is your thought when some economists term a K-shaped growth model that they say China's economy is developing into?
Well, I don't think that's a case enough to describe this, the trend. Maybe it's not just for the two different directions. Maybe there are even more, because the development in the different regions are really dynamic. In my understanding, maybe some of these regions are really good at, abilities for a higher income, and they want to buy some more innovative products. And some of them are in maybe the less developed areas. They want to have more of the are stable consumption in the different regions. So in my understanding that we want to address the differences based on the local differences. They're really not just trying to have a uniform way of development. They really want to make the better use of their resources and trying to find a better way to fit for the world. And I would say that is what the local provinces in different regions in China are really working for. They're really working very hard.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow, joining us from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. You are listening to World Today. I'm Ding He in Beijing. We'll be back after a very short break. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding He in Beijing. Artificial intelligence is reshaping economies, industries, and increasingly our job market. Here across China, universities are racing to launch new majors in areas like AI, robotics, and embodied intelligence, while corporations are creating demands for a new generation of tech-savvy workers. At the same time, though, concerns remain that artificial intelligence might someday replace many of our existing jobs. So, how should we understand this transformation, and how can our education systems better prepare for the younger generation for a future where humans and intelligent machines will increasingly work side by side? My colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Dr. Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics, joining us from Peking University.
Professor Li Lun, thank you very much for joining us. In universities, AI-related majors are booming across China, from robotics to embodied intelligence. So what does this tell us about where China's economy is heading over the next decade?
Yeah, so I think the China's next phase is moving from the consumer internet or the internet platform expansion towards a more AI-enabled industrial upgrading model. So the new majors that you mentioned are not just about computer science, because we have seen those majors booming in the past several years. I think the more popular majors include robotics, embodied intelligence, also the intersection between computer science and, for example, neurotechnology or the brain science, and also in their intersection between language, logic, and also some other humanities. So I think we're definitely pointing to a broader economy where AI is not just a new technology, it's going to be embedded in, for example, healthcare, in factories, in transportation, in a lot of services. So we have seen, for example, in Beijing, this is quite revealing, which is, a lot of colleges are opening a lot of new programs, including AI. So the key phrase, I think, is AI plus, right? This is also, the target for that's released by China State Council. So I think the AI plus industry requires more hybrid workers. So people who both understand AI, but also understand something else like manufacturing, logistics, medicine, or finance. I think the biggest demand for these talents were not just for coders or computer scientists, but also for people who can really translate and apply AI into the real world and improve the productivity in that sector.
And you mentioned AI plus. Actually, China plans to establish a comprehensive AI education framework by the year 2030. So how early should AI education begin, and what skills should students learn beyond coding and technical knowledge?
Yeah, I think AI education, in my opinion, should begin very early, maybe as early as in primary school. But I think it has to be step by step, because for younger students, I think AI is a really good tool to kind of enhance their understanding for the world, also to encourage their curiosity. And also, I think the students can be taught to how to responsibly use AI. For middle school or high school students, I think the use of AI can move towards understanding of, for example, physics, or how to learn something through a project, or even to apply them to more frontier applications, for example, for high school students. And for college students, apparently, I think it's we need to have more majors that's targeted to different areas and different occupations that needs the application of AI. I think coding or technical knowledge is useful, but I think merely knowing coding is not enough. I think students also need the literacy for how to responsibly use AI and how to kind of decompose the problem into something that the AI could understand. For example, how to write more responsible and more efficient prompts. Also, I think the more important thing is the human judgment. how to verify if the AI's output is correct, how to identify if the AI have hallucination or bias, and how to protect the privacy or understand the ethics that's associated with using AI. So I think overall, the AI literacy should become something like the scientific literacy or digital literacy. It should be educated in a relatively early stage, but I think it has to come in different steps.
And one concern worldwide is that AI will replace jobs, but China's data annotation industry and other AI-related sectors are creating new employment opportunities. So how should we understand this balance between the job displacement and job creation?
Yeah, I think there's definitely evidence for both risk and opportunities. So I think the best way to think of AI is not just jobs versus no jobs, but how do we allocate some of the task within the job to AI? For example, we can use AI to automate some of the routine and repetitive tasks like basic writing, data entry, translation, for example, and very simple and administrative functions. But at the same time, I think AI could threaten or also create some new jobs. For example, there's a report by the World Economic Forum that the global labor market disruption could affect as much as 22% of jobs by 2030. But there's also going to be creating 170 million new roles created. So I think this is a classic case of creative destruction. There's going to be some new jobs created, some old jobs being replaced. I think the key is about how can workers move from the low value, easily automated work into the higher value AI complementary roles. So in that case, the workers can better use AI to enhance their performance in the job rather than being simply replaced by AI.
And China is integrating AI into education while simultaneously expanding smart manufacturing nationwide. So how closely linked are talent development and industrial upgrading?
Yeah, I think they're closely linked or inseparable. So because, the smart manufacturing isn't just about buying these robots or installing these robots. It also requires people who can really operate and also maintain and improve these systems. And we could rely on AI for some of these functions, but by the end of the day, the human's preference, the human's feeling, and human's knowledge is also very important for pointing out the direction for industrial upgrading. So I think, as I mentioned, this industrial upgrading is creating a lot of demand for workers who can combine their AI knowledge with their practical knowledge in their production process. For example, a factory could need workers who understand both the AI vision systems and also how to do the inspection in their daily work. Mm-hmm. So I think this is why the vocational education or vocational training is going to matter, because a lot of the most important AI jobs in the real economy is not in the coding or research roles. There are roles that's applied inside the factories. So I think how do we really establish this training system in the vocational education? I think it's also very important in the future.
And experts say AI is not just another technology, but a foundational technology like electricity or the internet. So do you agree with that? And how might it reshape China's competitive advantages?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that general description, but I think right now we're not currently at that stage yet, because electricity or internet right now it's something that we can't really go without. So for example, even for any profession, you can't really operate without the electricity, without the computer, for example, without the internet. But for a lot of professions right now, at least AI is not the necessity, But I do think AI has the potential features of a general purpose technology because it can improve the production, the design, the logistics, the service sectors, also in terms of scientific research, education. So its impact is going to be economy-wide. So I do think that China, in this case, have some competitive advantage. Basically, it really comes from we're really good at combining AI with a very large industrial base and into a wide range of application scenarios. So we already have very deep manufacturing capacity. We have a good supply chain and also fast iteration for products. So this is giving us a head start if we embed AI into these systems, and we can create more goods into more innovation in a very fast speed. But I think the real competition in the future is not really who has the strongest or fastest model, but who can really turn AI into productivity. And I do think China have a unique competitive advantage in that front.
So finally, what do you think will be the most significant impact of AI on China's workforce? Is that higher productivity, new industries, better jobs, or completely redefine how work really looks like in the future?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. I think the economic impact or the most immediate impact will definitely be higher productivity because AI, we're already seeing, is helping workers to produce, especially in terms of documents, coding, in terms of customer service. They're already increasing the productivity by hundreds of times. But I think in terms of what you mentioned, completely redefine the meaning of work, that's the immediate or long-term impact because, there's going to be a rise of new industries, new job categories, and also maybe redefining what humans understand to be work and what's the meaning or the ethics behind what we call work. So this is also going to potentially create a reshaping of the social structure. But I mean, it's definitely going to take more effort to understand and also to address this concern in the future.
Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics from Peking University, speaking with my colleague Zhao Yang. This is World Today. We'll be back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. The European Union has launched the membership accession process for Ukraine and Moldova. The official launch on Monday requires both countries to commit to years of political reforms. For Ukraine, it also has to begin this very complicated process, even as the country remains in a war with Russia. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas calls the start of the process a major milestone. And attending an intergovernmental conference held in Luxembourg, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Taras Kachika called for faster and more comprehensive accession to the EU. For more, my colleague Gao Yingshi spoke with Zhang Xing, Deputy Director of the Center for Russian Studies, East China Normal University.
The European Union has officially launched the accession process for Ukraine and Moldova to join the bloc. How do you see the timing of this move, especially with Ukraine still in a conflict with Russia?
Obviously, the European Union has speed up the process of Ukraine and Moldova's possible membership. The European Union has seen this as an effective way to a large extent to counter Russia pressure on this region. Not only the ongoing military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but also what is perceived as intensified Russian pressure on Moldova, especially those regions within Moldova with a significant tie with Russia, with certain separatist potential. So I think this is a very clear sign that the European Union wants to use these potential membership for these two countries, and possibly Georgia in a slightly different format as a way to counter Russian influence, Russian pressure in this region.
And their report says Ukraine views EU membership as a security guarantee, but from the EU's perspective, admitting Ukraine risks pulling the bloc into the conflict with Russia. How does this difference in expectations shape the process, and how can the EU manage that balance?
Ukraine associated a potential security guarantee mostly associated with NATO, but not the EU. EU itself is not a provider of security, at least security in a narrow, strict sense. Right? So Ukraine's potential membership in EU and isn't perceived as a strict security guarantee, at least in a traditional sense. And also Russia's recent response to these issues, at least on a discursive level, also make it clear it's not countering Ukraine's joining EU per se, but it's countering tendency of EU itself becoming a military bloc, which I don't think is happening right now. On these 2 points, I think that the difference in expectation, as you described in the question, isn't a very prominent point of conflict yet, at least for now.
Moldova is moving along the same path alongside Ukraine. How does this journey compare, and what challenge does Moldova face on its own road toward EU membership?
If we compare Moldova with Ukraine, I see there are several differences. One is Moldova internally is probably more divided on its the EU membership, and also the idea of a full European integration in Moldova is internally more divisive than what we see in Ukraine now, at least now. It wasn't like that maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but now I think within Moldova it's more politically divisive. And secondly, I think relative to Ukraine, Moldova is a much smaller state, and it's not a state with a huge population or with huge economic assets in terms of land, agriculture, or other important economic resources. So it doesn't hold the same attraction, especially in terms of economic resources. It doesn't hold the same attraction to European Union as Ukraine holds. That would make its potential membership with EU even less economically well-grounded. So I think in the long run, we'll have a probably slightly bumpier road of being absorbed into EU as a full member state relative to Ukraine.
EU member states once held different views on Ukraine's past, but Hungary has recently dropped its objection, with much of that earlier division now resolved. Do you think the EU has the unity it needs to carry this process?
Indeed. I think Hungary used to be the major bloc against Ukraine's possible membership in EU. With the change of its government, now the new government, the new prime minister, is generally more in line with EU's overall policy stance regarding Ukraine's possible membership. But I think within the EU there are different types of opposition. It will not be voiced directly on a single member states level. There's no Hungary under Orban in its policy towards Ukraine right now within EU. But I think the opposition voices will be expressed in a slightly different format and will be voiced on different scales within EU, not necessarily on the national government level, but opposition against Ukraine's membership because it's potential influence on EU economy. One is on more economic terms, right? Absorption of Ukraine, at least at the current terms that we can imagine, will be a big shock to EU's internal economy. Very likely more funds will be allocated to Ukrainian economy. Joining of Ukraine's certain markets will be a negative shock for some of the existing producers within the EU economy, agriculture in particular, as we already see how much opposition farmers or the agriculture producers, some of the Central Eastern European countries are very much against further opening EU market to potential Ukrainian agricultural products. Second opposition is the concern of the security implication. The concern is a full membership for Ukraine would really raise the level of securitization of EU as a whole, especially in its relation with Russia. That kind of concern has been within EU for quite some time. It's not completely gone, and we will see that being expressed on different levels in Ukraine's future membership path towards its full membership. I think that process is going to be a quite difficult process. I wouldn't be surprised some opposition voices will be strong within EU as this process becomes more materialized.
The accession process requires Ukraine to deliver serious reforms on its political system, including the judiciary and lawmaking process, all while at war. How realistic is it for Kiev to meet all these demands under such extraordinary circumstances?
You're absolutely right to raise this question. It's a serious concern both for Ukraine and for those within EUs who are more positive on EU's full integration. There are some positive signs. Even before 2022, there were already some reforms that more or less along with EU's standard. That shows under difficult conditions, that kind of reforms still are possible, is manageable. But on the other hand, I think we are only at the very early stages. I think Monday's announcement only means Ukraine and Moldova started at the very first stage or first class among the 5 or 6 major clusters of policy reforms EU membership would require. Those are very, very political changing its political system, judicial. So we're only at the very, very early stages. When we move on to the other clusters, I think things will be more difficult, particularly as you mentioned, in the de facto war context. Right? One big issue is the so-called transparency and corruption, and partly because of the war context. That part of the reform process in Ukraine in the past few years wasn't going very well. So I think it has some successful experience already, but as we move along, cluster by cluster, I think the next few steps will be much, much more difficult, and it will be at least partially conditional on how the military conflict are going on, or in what way this military conflict will be partially settled, hopefully in the near future.
Zhang Xing, Deputy Director of the Center for Russian Studies, East China Normal University, speaking with my colleague Gao Yingshi. You are listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. The Central Bank of Japan has increased its main interest rate to a new 31-year high. On Tuesday, the Bank of Japan raised its so-called policy rate to 1% from a reading of 0.75%, its highest level since the year 1995. Some other central banks across the world have also raised the interest rates this year as the war between the U.S. and Iran pushed up the cost of living. Japan's interest rates were cut aggressively back in the 1990s to combat the fallout from a collapse in terms of the prices for property and equities. They had been near zero for 2 decades as growth stagnated. The BOJ has been gradually raising its key interest rates since March 2024. So for more, joining us now on the line is Muhammad Ali Nasir, Professor of Economics at the University of Leeds. Thank you very much for joining us. So first of all, in your observation, has Japan entered a kind of, inflationary cycle after 20 years of deflation? Does Japan still need a, so to speak, crisis management monetary policy?
Yes, it's true that after decades of deflation, now Japan is something what we can call inflationary cycle. Although the inflation in Japan is still lower than other major economies like US, UK, and others. But if we look at the trajectory of the Japanese economy, there are things to be worried about, and there are things to be worried about for the Japanese fiscal policy makers and also the monetary policy makers. As such, I don't think this is we can call like a crisis situation. But Japan is not really used to a high inflation regime. So it's not only the matter that there's an increase in inflation and how much it is. If we look at an economy, we can say whether that is an average level of inflation which has persisted for a prolonged period of time, and the participants in the economy, the firms, the household, they make their decision based on the expected level of inflation. So if the inflation started to increase in an economy where it's been deflation, there could be a problem in terms of then inflation expectation and how to make investment decisions for the future. Because we don't know how much the inflation would be. So the adjustment to a new normal is difficult for the household and the firm. So that could be a challenge which the Bank of Japan is facing. And there's also an increase in the expected rate of inflation in the Japan. So although the inflation is not that high at the moment, particularly the core inflation, it is below the 2% target. But the producer inflation, that is a lot higher. It's higher than 6% and driven by the recent energy shock.
Yeah.
So I can understand the difficulty in which the Bank of Japan is at the moment. There could be challenges to the price stability and the inflation expectations. But there is also a bigger long-term problems which are associated with the Japanese economy, which is the demographic problem, high level of debt, which also have implications for the inflation and inflation expectations in the Japan.
Yeah, those long-term problems are really structural, I guess, challenges facing the Japanese economy. Now, Professor, of course, I mean, raising interest rates could help lower inflation, that's for sure. But in the meantime, it will also mean higher borrowing costs for the governments, for businesses. In particular, Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi is a politician known for her support for boosting spending in Japan. So do you think the Japanese government and businesses can afford this expected higher borrowing costs?
Yeah, basically, inflation is not a cause. What I call inflation is a symptom of underlying problems. We always need to diagnose what is the cause of inflation, and we address the cause. It has been booming economy that has caused the increase, that has led to increase in the demand, and then inflation in Japan. Then we could say, okay, increasing the interest rate makes sense. But here, when the economy is stagnating, is not growing at a very astronomical rate, the inflation is due to the cost push shock or increase in the energy prices. Now, if you increase the interest rate to suppress the demand in the economy, then it would of course lead to increase in the cost of borrowing. It will create problem for the household, for the firm, for the government. It may lead to reduction in inflation, but that will come at a very high cost. Now the question is whether that is really a cost worth paying. Would we like to have a slightly higher inflation with economy which is booming, or we would like to have no inflation but economy which is stagnating? Okay, so I think I would probably go with little bit tolerance to a little bit of inflation and let the economy function. Particularly this recent inflation shock is not to do with booming economy, but it is due to the increase in the energy prices, which I don't think gonna be affected by increasing the interest rate. There are different policies, energy policies they need to focus on. They need to focus on their public policy than using monetary policy to address energy price shock. So that is, I think, is the situation we have.
So since, Professor, you have highlighted the energy issue or the energy challenges facing Japan, I mean, Japan depends heavily on oil and gas from the Middle East. Do you think this status quo in terms of Japan's energy supply is going to change anytime soon? Briefly, 1 minute.
Well, I mean, the energy policy, you need to have a long-term view. Like, I think this is somewhere maybe Japan can learn from China. It need to have a long-term strategy. It need to have a long-term energy policy. Like China, it could focus more on a diverse energy mix with a bigger proportion of renewables, and it could focus on its public policy in energy sector. It could focus on its public policy in demographic areas where it is a big shrinking population. We have lost about over 6 million Japanese in the last few years. Its population has been shrinking very fast, which is a challenge for Japan. And also the fiscal policy, high level of public debt. So those issues need to be addressed. And again, I'll come back to that it needs to have a long-term and better energy strategy. And perhaps it should learn from Chinese case, where China has implemented a very successful energy policy, which is a long term, and therefore it has in a way.
Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Muhammad Ali Nasir joining us from the University of Leeds in Britain. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Ding He in Beijing. Bye for now.